In this episode, we'll take a look at the Zoom PodTrak P8 live stream and podcast recorder. Let's jump right into the features and the pros. First of all, 6 XLR inputs for professional microphones, and each of those inputs can provide phantom power, individually switched, and each of them can supply up to 70 dB of gain. So in this case, for example, we are using the Shure SM7B. It's a dynamic microphone. It's one of the microphones that require more gain than almost any other dynamic microphone, and it's very popular amongst podcasters. And you'll see here, if I come into this input, we don't even have to push the input all the way to the max to get a good strong level. So can you run a Shure SM7B into the PodTrak P8? You certainly can. And this is what it sounds like. This entire episode is recorded with a Shure SM7B into the PodTrak P8. We also have an additional input, a 3.5mm input for a phone or other mobile device. And you also have this secondary port that allows you to add a Bluetooth adapter, so you can connect to any Bluetooth source via Bluetooth and use this input to play back any audio from that. So you could add a remote caller, you could play music, anything like that. You also have the sound pads here, and the sound pads, not only do you have 9 of them here, let's just go ahead and demonstrate those real quick. In addition to these 9 pads here, there are actually 4 banks of these. So if we come here, we can switch from bank A all the way over to bank D. So we have lots of inputs that we can use. Right now I have it set to bank D. Let's get back over to bank A. There are pre-recorded audio clips. Now, of course, you can record your own. So if you have a podcast where you have an intro, you can put that recorded intro in here and then just play that back. That'll make post-processing a lot easier for you because the intro will already be in there. Or if you have an advertisement or anything else along those lines, you can put all of those in the sound pads here. We also have a 4.3-inch touchscreen in its color. It is a really nice size, actually. It makes it very easy to see everything you need to see, including the meters, including the recording time, all of the different controls you may need to get into, including the input menus. Just makes it very easy to operate. Nice job on that. For each input, you have a mute and an on-air button. And what these allow you to do, of course, if you have someone that needs to cough really quickly, a mute button's really nice. Or perhaps somebody that won't be joining the podcast until a little bit later, you can mute their input. You can see here I have all the inputs we're not currently using muted, just so that they don't introduce any sort of interference or additional noise. Now, this on-air button is kind of interesting. So you'll notice here there's an on-air button on the screen. If I press that, what the on-air button defines right here is what gets recorded and how it gets recorded. So in this first case here, we have a setting here called noise reduction. Any of the inputs that have the on-air selected will be included in this noise reduction processing. And what it will do essentially is an auto mix. So anyone that's not currently talking, it will actually reduce the input level automatically on their microphones until they do start talking. And the reason that's so important and useful is that that will make for a much cleaner, much better sounding recording. You won't get nearly as much noise. And I think they've implemented this really nicely. You can see in our sample podcast right here in the next few minutes how well that turned out. And that's a mix of live and pre-recorded.
And plenty of entertainment.
and plenty of entertainment.
But I mean, they definitely have an outline. So.
Yes.
Yeah, they have the goal, and yeah, it's a good mix. So, all right. So, anything else? Any other thoughts about live streams? And one thing I did find interesting, I will say. Well, actually, I'll hold on to that. Anything else? What are your other thoughts about live stream, good or bad, or just observations?
I think it's worth trying if you think you might want to do one. I never thought, last year at this time, I never thought I'd be doing a live stream, but I did 2 fiddle workshops, and people seemed to like them. And it was actually easier to do than I thought it might be. I mean, it was plenty of work, but the actual being on the camera and talking to nobody in particular went okay.
Good.
Yeah. I would say live is a lot of fun from both the audience and producer's point of view. So obviously I work on the live streams, your live streams every week. And
as a technical director.
yes,
Yeah.
so doing all the pressing buttons, and I actually have a lot of fun doing that. The signal flow is interesting to observe and see everything that's happening. And as an audience of several types and genres of live stream, I also enjoy seeing people's creativity and just, having a glimpse into what they're doing. And also, as an introvert and somebody who doesn't always like talking to people, it's actually a nice way to still get some kind of interaction.
Yeah, agreed. Now you also have a series of outputs. First up at the top, if you have any sort of powered speakers or monitors, we have 1/4-inch outputs here, and you can control the levels here with this dial right there. In addition to that, you have headphone outputs for each of the up to 6 participants, so of course corresponding to the 6 XLR microphone inputs. Each person has an independent headphone volume control knob, which is really nice, so you can get it just the right loudness for the people listening and participating in your podcast. You also have control of the USB output volume or level with this dial right here. And also for the phone input here, you have a slider or fader, if you will, for that input, and also a fader for the sound pads. On the back of the unit, we do have a USB-C port that allows you to connect this to your computer as a USB audio interface, or to transfer files to your computer. Here's how you go into the transfer mode right there. Now, when you are using that USB-C port and this is connected to your computer as a USB audio interface, it's just recording stereo. It's not recording each individual input. However, you can record each individual input separately on the PodTrak P8 itself. So if you're connected to the computer, it's just a mix of all the mics. If you're on the PodTrak, it's a mix of all the mics. Plus, you can also record the individual microphone inputs if you want to do super careful mixing in post. There are a variety of ways to power the PodTrak P8. It comes with an AC adapter, which is what we're using right now to power it. You can also power it via USB, so that USB-C input can also power. So when you're connected to your computer powers the PodTrak P8. In addition to that, on the bottom there is a slot here to take 4 AA batteries, and in our test, powering with 4 Eneloop batteries. It's just a standard Eneloop that are actually quite old, these particular copies I have. We were able to power recording 2 inputs for 3 hours and 34 minutes, just to give you a sense. You could probably record a little bit longer with lithium batteries, and probably not as long with alkaline batteries. Now, you do have some effects for each of the inputs, and let's just show you those 2 here now. First of all, we have a limiter. This is really useful if you are in a situation where people may get really loud, louder than expected. And what this will do is prevent that situation from resulting in distortion and clipping. This is really helpful for that. In fact, in this case, let's go ahead and turn the limiter on. Let me set the input to max and see if I can get it to clip. Here's an example of using the limiter on the PodTrak P8. All right, back down to normal. That's what the limiter sounds like. Now let's turn the limiter off and try that again. This is what it sounds like when I've turned the limiter off on the PodTrak P8. All right, there's an example with and without. We also have a low-cut filter. In recording spaces, especially if you're doing things at home or other places that are not a studio, a lot of times you'll have air conditioning, maybe refrigerators, other things that make noise. And what a low-cut filter can do for you is help prevent some of that noise from getting into your recording. Now, of course, your microphone choice is going to make a big difference as well, but it's nice to be able to have that low cut there, just to kind of cut out some of that low-frequency information or sound that you really don't need. We also have a tone setting. Let's go ahead and turn that on. Right now it's at its neutral setting. And now I've moved it over to its bass setting, so you can hear what that sounds like. Of course, you can kind of tune that to wherever you want it. Here's a little bit less. And there's the neutral setting right there. And then here's the treble setting. If I need to something that's a much brighter, more articulate, then you can do that as well. Not a great fit for my voice, but there if you need it. All right, next up, let's go ahead and play with the compressor de-esser. This is an all-in-one thing. You have a single slider. We can turn that on. Let me just go ahead and increase that so you can hear what it sounds like. Here's the strongest compressor de-esser setting right here. And then let's go ahead and pull that back maybe about halfway. There's about halfway on the compressor de-esser. And then finally, we'll bring it down to a more minimal setting. That'll just sort of help to even things out a little bit. So a lot of times, many of us at the start of our sentence, we are louder than by the end of our sentence. This helps to even that out a little bit. And it also uses a de-esser. I have a lot of sibilance in my voice. When I say the letter S or C, there's kind of a sizzling noise. And the de-esser will help to manage a little bit of that. Here we are without the compressor or de-esser at all. And here it's back on again at a minimal setting. We might bump it up just a little bit. All right. Probably my favorite feature of the PodTrak P8 is the noise reduction feature. We talked a little bit about that before, but when you've got multiple people, the more mics you have, the more potential noise in your recording. And what this on-air noise reduction feature does is that for the people that are not talking, it reduces their input level, so you're not hearing as much from them. You're not picking up as much noise in their overall recording. And as soon as they start talking, it brings them back up to their normal volume. So really, really nice feature, very well implemented. And we'll talk about that when we get to the comparison with the RODECaster Pro. This is a pretty nice feature. You also have the ability to record individual input tracks, and you can record them in their original form without any sort of processing, or you can also bake in, if you will, the tone and compressor settings. So if you want to add that additional bass and you don't have to do any additional processing in post, go ahead and bake that into your recording and you're set to go. Great if you need to turn around your project very quickly. The PodTrak P8 records to SDHC or SDXC cards, which is great because those are super available, very inexpensive, and these days they seem quite reliable. No product is perfect. There are a couple of cons I want to cover here. Number one is that this records in 44.1 kilohertz 16-bit WAV files only. Now, when I reviewed the PodTrak P4, I kind of shrugged my shoulders and kind of didn't understand why Zoom made that same decision for the PodTrak P4. They've done that again with the PodTrak P8. And as I've thought about it more, I'm actually a bit more annoyed with that decision. Here's what I'm thinking. Now, you're not going to hear a huge difference of recording 48 kilohertz versus 44.1 kilohertz. 44.1 is the CD standard. CDs are, good quality. Not an issue with that. What I do take issue with is that if you are going to use this along with video, 48 kilohertz is generally the standard sample rate for video. This does not support that. To me, that seems like a really bad decision. And hardware-wise, in 2021, there should be no reason that Zoom cannot support 48 kilohertz. And if it's just a software issue, I would implore you, Zoom, to please do a firmware update where we can switch to 48 kilohertz. Now, you can always upsample to 48 kilohertz, but that's not a great move in terms of audio quality. And you might say, well, you can upload to YouTube at 44.1 kilohertz. And that's true, you can. But if I'm working, for example, if I'm an interviewee or an interviewer for a broadcast television show, and I want to use something like this, it's not really an option unless I'm going to do that upsampling. And it just is an annoyance. Zoom, there's no reason not to support 48 kilohertz. Please change it if you can. The second main con I want to talk about is the build quality. It's actually pretty decent, except for the plastic. It's 100% plastic, it feels like. This plastic here is not that great. It feels cheap. And in fact, it looks like it's the same material that the PodTrak P4 is made out of. This has been stored in a drawer, and I've got this kind of gouge in it. I don't know if you can see that here very well. Not a huge deal, but man, if you ever drop this thing, I'm not sure how well it would hold up. I feel like for a $500 device, they could have stepped this up a little bit. Now, with either of those cons, would that prevent me from recommending this? The 44.1 kilohertz is really annoying, and I think it's a perfect example of a company crippling a product that they didn't need to cripple. Is it going to be a big issue for people that are just doing audio-only podcasts? Probably not. Is it going to be a problem for people doing even video podcasts to YouTube and things like that? Probably not. But again, it provides no support for the video standard of 48 kilohertz, and there's really no excuse for that in 2021. So if that's not an issue for you, well, I guess go ahead. But Zoom, please add 48 kilohertz. Now, let's talk about this in relation to the RODECaster Pro, because I think that's the most direct competitor. This is $500 US. The RODECaster Pro at the time of this review comes in at $600 US. So they're pretty similar in price. There are a few differences here that I want to kind of call out, and then I'll talk about what my recommendations are overall between those two devices. Here's one way I would put this that I think hopefully would be helpful for people. If the RODECaster Pro had the same, what Zoom calls the noise reduction feature, which I would actually probably would have preferred them to call an auto mix feature, to me, the RODECaster Pro would be a no-brainer. Automatically, I would recommend the RODECaster Pro unless you needed 6 inputs, 6 different microphones. The RODECaster Pro only has 4. Now, I say only. Very few podcasts need more than 4 microphone inputs at a time. So for me, I would make the RODECaster Pro the obvious choice. However, it does not have an auto mix feature. It has a noise gate feature for each input. And to be honest, it's a lot more difficult to set up and really fine-tune a noise gate to sound good relative to using a noise reduction feature or an auto mix feature like the PodTrak P8 has. So PodTrak P8, that really is, from my point of view, kind of a killer feature. It's a really, really great feature. I like that the PodTrak P8 uses SD cards as opposed to the micro SD cards that the RODECaster Pro uses. For some people, that's not going to matter. For me, it's a lot easier to lose a micro SD card than it is to lose an SD card. So for me, that just is a convenience feature. You'll have to decide for yourself how important that is. Now, I will say on the RODECaster Pro, it gives you more control over all of the individual features. It also records at 48 kilohertz. So, and it also allows you to connect to your computer via USB-C and transfer all of the individual microphone inputs, not just the mix. So it definitely has an edge on the PodTrak P8 from that standpoint. All of those effects, the compressor, you can get in there and change the attack, the release, the ratio, and really fine-tune its sound. Now, not that the compressor sounds bad on the PodTrak P8. I think it actually sounds pretty good if you go kind of light on it. But I really, as someone that really loves audio, I love to get in there and be able to control those settings a little bit more. So for me, that would make me lean a little bit more towards the RODECaster Pro. Now, to me, the build quality of the RODECaster Pro just feels much more solid. Yes, there's plastic in it, but there's also a good bit of metal, and it just seems like it's better put together. With the PodTrak P8, if you're going to move it around, that is, you could take it mobile, I would be very hesitant to throw it in a bag with anything else. It's going to need its own bag to keep it protected. If you throw it in there with cables and things like that, I think you're going to scratch things up and it's just not going to hold up well. I also appreciate the more powerful preamplifiers of the Zoom PodTrak P8. So you've got up to 70 dB of gain, so I don't need any sort of cloud lifter or FET head to make my SM7B from Shure microphone work. If I've got a really gain-hungry microphone like this, I can do that directly into the PodTrak P8. With the RODECaster, it's kind of on the edge. I can get away with it if I'm not opposed to do any sort of additional processing in post to get the loudness where it needs to be. But this just makes it really easy. So good job on Zoom for providing 70 dB of gain. So in the end, which would I recommend? I think it's really a trade-off. It really depends on what you need. The thing that makes me kind of sway towards the PodTrak P8 a little bit more is the noise reduction feature. That is such a useful feature for podcasts. Almost all of us are recording in spaces that are not great from an acoustic standpoint, and being able to just turn that feature on and not have to do a whole bunch of processing in post to make it sound clean is really, really nice and saves a ton of time. On the other hand, I'm really quite annoyed with some decisions that Zoom made. For example, I talked about the sample rate. I also really like the ability to change some of the parameters on the settings in the RODECaster, which you cannot control with that level of kind of granularity in the PodTrak P8. So for me, I'm really kind of torn between the two. In the end, I would say I hope I've provided enough information here. We'll go ahead and put a link for the RODECaster Pro review, which we did up here. You want to go see that in more detail, but hopefully between those two, there's enough information for you to make a decision about which of these will fit better for you. They're both actually pretty good devices. They're pretty good. I like them both. I would probably say I love the Zoom if they change that sample rate. Now, if you are podcasting, I would choose the PodTrak P8 without hesitation over the LiveTrak series from Zoom. For example, the LiveTrak L8, which is something we reviewed earlier in 2020, We'll put a link for that review up here. If it's between the LiveTrak and this, I would absolutely choose this over the LiveTrak. This is a dedicated recorder that's made specifically for podcasting. The preamps have more gain. The noise reduction feature is an amazing feature that will make things so much easier for your podcast. So if it's between the LiveTrak L8 and the PodTrak P8, absolutely my recommendation is the PodTrak P8. So hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.